So if you're initiating the conversation, start with facts, not emotions. Instead of leading with, oh my gosh, this is so terrible, start with something neutral. Validating feelings makes it easier for someone to hear the facts without feeling attacked.
And finally, you can keep the conversation grounded in your broader principles that you both share. You might say, regardless of politics, I feel that most people agree children shouldn't be put at risk. How do you think the law balances safety with enforcement? How do you think it should balance safety with enforcement? These are questions that can get you both thinking and shifts the discussion from blame to problem solving.
Accurate knowledge helps you avoid spreading fear or misinformation. Stories about children, families, and vulnerable people remind us that immigration is not just policy, it's real lives. Listening with empathy helps your community respond with care, not just with opinion. Ashley, I just don't understand why people can't come here legally. My grandparents totally did it the right way. Why should today be any different?
Well, I know you say that your grandparents came here legally, but it's just not that simple anymore. Immigration laws have changed so much since then, and the legal system has been backlogged for years. And so many families, they just can't come because there isn't a legal pathway available for them.
I hear that, but come on now. Illegal crossings put a burden on taxpayers. It's dangerous. We can't have open borders. Criminals get through, definitely.
Well, I wouldn't say that we have open borders. I definitely don't think anyone advocates for that. And it's actually really difficult to immigrate. So we don't have open borders. But also, the majority of immigrants who come, they want to work hard. They're trying to support their families. And most of them even pay taxes, but they don't get any of the benefits. So immigration really just isn't simple.
But again, I'm thinking about the ones who commit crimes. Aren't many of the people who come over illegally committing a crime and then they're taking jobs away from Americans? You just said they're coming here to work. And so that's a job that my neighbor could be doing.
Well, but you're really focusing on the worst examples. Studies show that immigrants actually have a lower crime rate than American citizens. And so many industries rely on the immigrants to do the work that Americans don't want to do. So you say your neighbor would want to do it, but would they really?
I mean, money's money. I think, honestly, you're just kind of making excuses. This is what I hear from all my liberal lefty friends. Laws are laws. If people break them, there have to be consequences.
That's right. But like I said, it's just not that simple. And I'm not saying that laws are broken. I'm saying that punishing families without fixing the system doesn't solve anything. There has to be a better way.
And we're going to just have to agree to disagree.
I guess.
Well, does this sound or feel familiar? Just reading through this caused my blood pressure to go up. Hi, I'm Tracie L. Morgan, an immigration attorney in Atlanta with over 15 years of experience.
And I'm Ashley Glimasinski, a community advocate, a former ESL teacher, and a friend of immigrants.
And I'm also friends with Ashley, just to make that clear.
Yes.
We are here to help you make sense of immigration news, separate facts from opinion, and understand what it means for you and your community. We'll do a deep dive into a recent story, but then also talk through some other hot-button topics within immigration and how to be thoughtful and intentional in your approach and reaction to them.
News can be overwhelming or confusing. So we're going to talk about how to understand the stories so you can talk about immigration confidently. Immigration is such a charged topic because it isn't just about laws and policies. It's about people's sense of identity, their fairness, and security. And on one level, it's emotional. Immigration raises questions like, who belongs here? What kind of country do we want to be? And for some, immigrants enrich culture and bring new opportunities. But for others, it stirs anxiety about change or loss. On another level, immigration is practical. People worry about things like jobs, wages, schools, and healthcare, whether or not the data supports those fears. Immigration gets tied up in questions of fairness, too. If some people wait years to come legally, is it right for others to arrive another way? And of course, politics and media both play a role in immigration. Leaders and commentators often highlight immigration to energize their supporters, which can magnify fears and division.
But underneath all of that, and I'm not discounting that, but there are real human stakes. Families are making hard choices, kids are growing up in uncertainty, and communities are trying to balance compassion with the rule of law. That's why immigration debates can feel so intense. They touch on identity, economics, security, and humanity all at once. It's not just a policy conversation, it's a values conversation. So, how do we get at the core of these issues while staying calm and not giving into heated rhetoric, especially when the headlines we read play directly into our fears and anxieties?
So let's look at a headline from a recent time. Over Labor Day weekend in 2025, there was a story that came out about Guatemalan children in U.S. custody who were set to be removed from the United States. Now, depending on your news source, you could have read a title that said, Chaotic Showdown Over Guatemalan Children Exposes Fault Lines in Trump's Deportation Push. And that's from ABC News. Words like chaotic and showdown in this title immediately create a sense of urgency and conflict. This headline frames the story as a political drama, a clash between the Trump administration and its critics, but with children caught in the middle. And it stirs emotions like anxiety, frustration, and even anger at the sense that vulnerable kids are being swept up in a political fight.
And then another headline that you might have seen or come across is What to Know About Guatemalan Migrant Children and the Efforts to Send Them Home. And this comes from PBS NewsHour. And this is certainly a bit more calm, more neutral. It invites the reader to learn, not necessarily to react. However, the word home can feel comforting. But in this context, it glosses over the danger that many of these kids fear going back to Guatemala. And so emotions that you might have gotten from that first headline about anxiety and fear, that goes away with this current headline. You might be thinking about curiosity, maybe some sympathy, but I definitely think there's a lot less urgency with this headline. It risks making the issue feel abstract.
Yeah. And finally, you might have seen the headline, Trump administration plans to remove nearly 700 unaccompanied migrant children. That's from the LA Times. And this headline is stark. Numbers like 700 children make the scale overwhelming. Words like remove and unaccompanied highlight vulnerability and government power. The emotions stirred in you might be sadness, anger, outrage, compassion. The mental picture of hundreds of children being put on planes without their parents or legal guardians is powerful.
I think I just went through the whole range of emotions myself. So let's break this down, though, and look at what are the essential facts in this news story. Well, number one, we know the U.S. government tried to deport almost 700 unaccompanied Guatemalan children, kids who came without parents, many of them as young as 10 or even younger, many of them afraid to return home because of violence or the risk that they would face. This plan happened all of a sudden. It was in the middle of the night. It was Labor Day weekend. Some of the children were reportedly awakened at night, 2 a.m. maybe, removed from their sponsor homes or even care shelters and loaded onto planes with very little notice. One of the things that makes this really complicated is that the U.S. initially said that the parents or guardians back in Guatemala asked for these children to return. Guatemala's own government, though, said that many of the parents specifically said they don't want their children to come back home. They talked about threats to their families, threats of violence, and also just the inability to care for their children and to care for them safely. A judge did step in, though, and ordered a temporary halt of these deportations, saying that the children are entitled to due process, which is the right to have their day in court and fair treatment under the law. These kids were entitled to certain legal protections, rights that might have been set aside. And just recently, too, the United States has walked back that claim that the parents wanted them back. But oh my gosh, can you imagine had the children been deported and sent back and then the U.S. goes, oops?
We have seen a case of that recently where the U.S. deported at least someone and said, oops, unfortunately. So back to this case, in the court filings about that night, the children talk about their feelings as this was all happening. So a 17-year-old boy said he was scared, lost his breath, and he started to pray. That's what you do when you're afraid. You pray. Another young girl was so scared to return that she threw up. And that's because her sister had been murdered in Guatemala, and she was certain the same thing would happen to her if she went back. And these are vivid examples of how immigration law isn't just about who's legal or who's undocumented. It's about vulnerable kids, about promises and protections that some argue are being overridden, and about what we owe to children in these situations. So, where do people usually get confused in a story like this, and why do they get confused? Well, they might get confused when thinking about who these children actually are. Many assume these kids came with a parent and then were separated by the US government. But in fact, most are unaccompanied minors, meaning they crossed the border without a parent. But that doesn't mean they don't have family here or that they're safe to return to Guatemala. The confusion comes from the difference between family separation and unaccompanied children. And what does sending them home mean? The phrase sounds simple and maybe even kind. Home implies safety and family for most of us. But for many of these children, home is where they fled violence and poverty, abuse, or human trafficking. So some parents in Guatemala even told the government they didn't want their children to be returned. They knew it was too dangerous. So the confusion lies in the emotional weight of the word home. It doesn't always mean safe.
And then we have to look at what the legal rights that are in place for these unaccompanied minors. A lot of people think, well, if anybody came to the U.S. illegally, can't the government just deport them? But under U.S. law, unaccompanied minors are entitled to hearings, the chance to claim asylum, and child-specific protections because they are so vulnerable. The confusion comes from not knowing that immigration law treats children differently, at least in theory, than adults. And the numbers just feel so shocking. 700 children sounds like a single event. You may have heard about caravans of people coming over, and this wasn't a caravan of 700 children appearing overnight. These were children who had come across the border at various times. Could have been a few months ago. It could have been a few years ago. But it does represent a long time of a backlog being created. These cases for unaccompanied minors move slowly. Asylum cases, for example, we've touched on this, may take 15 years to work through the system. And the confusion comes from this scale. 700 children, that just felt sudden to me. But the reality is that the 700 children represented a systematic backlog, cases that we should be taking care of faster.
Right. It's also complicated when we look at these news stories, and we want to just read it and take it at face value sometimes. But we have to realize also that we have bias when we look at these stories. There's a background of how we interpret them. So how can the listener interpret the story without that bias? And I think first it's important to recognize that we all have bias. Our socioeconomic status, where we grew up and where we live now, our religion, race, community, and so many other factors determine the lens with which we view the world around us. That includes the news and how we react to it. If you've never thought about your biases before, I really encourage you to do some learning about it and look into your own biases. And as we mentioned earlier, news sources will often present the stories differently, both in their headlines and in the way they report it. It may seem like some are purposefully distorting the facts, and maybe they are, but I remember again that everyone has their own biases that affect the way they see and tell a story. Media organizations also have their own priorities, like keeping their readers engaged and clicking links and supporting their work. So I'd like to share some wise words from an organization called Builders. And I read this in one of their articles recently, and it says, "The story we consume trains the story we tell, and eventually the story we live." So I take that to mean that when we consume stories that portray a certain narrative, it's the story we begin to believe, and eventually the one that we act on. This makes me think that the news sources that I read are really important in how I form my lens and how I view the world. So when I read the news, I want to get as fair a report as I can. And that's not easy, but when I have time, which is not every day, I try to read the same story from a few different sources to get different perspectives. And to do this, I just subscribe to daily news summary emails from different media, and it's interesting to see how they report or don't on the same story. So one news summary email might include a story, and the other one reports it with different language, or they might not even mention it at all. And that tells me maybe what the focus of this news organization is. And I like to subscribe to media sources that are slightly left or slightly right of center, just to see how differently they represent the facts and to understand how they are each trying to present it from their own biases. And to find these different media sources, I've used resources like the media bias chart from All Sides or the one from Ad Fontes Media to help me find sources that are balanced and have accurate reporting. It's really interesting to look at those sites because they do present left and right leaning sources. And it's interesting to see maybe the arc of how they are portrayed as well, from less truthful or less factual to more factual. So it's a helpful way to get an idea of which news sources I can trust when I read them. And when you look at different sources, you can also listen from multiple perspectives. For example, in the story of the Guatemalan children that we've talked about, you can consider the government's rationale, the children's needs, advocacy groups, and international actors. And balancing these viewpoints prevents jumping to simplistic conclusions.
And Ashley, I think about recent events and going on social media, and social media is not the news. I want to point that out. If you see something on social media, you need to vet it. But it was like two different events happened, right? You look through your feed, and on one side, people are saying one thing, and then you have friends that are of a different political persuasion, and they're saying something completely different. And you're like, are you looking at the same event? Are you looking at the same person? And to me, that was such a vivid example of where these biases come in at. I'm still processing that and will be for a while, but man, that was eye-opening. And so with all of that, I think you can't just analyze with your brain. You also have to analyze your heart. What are you feeling? What is your emotional response to this story? So feeling anger, sadness, or fear, that's all absolutely natural. But check whether that feeling comes from the headline's framing or the actual facts. Ask yourself, what do I actually know versus what does this story make me feel? You can also recognize that sometimes the media is trying to make you feel a certain way so that you'll react a certain way. And sometimes the world is just hard. Our bodies are responding to that. And we aren't meant to live in a 24-hour news cycle or to hear about death and hardship in one frame of social media and laugh at a cat video in the next. Nothing against cat videos. So when you feel an emotional response to the news, I encourage you to take a moment. And I know that's really hard in our fast-paced world, but even just 30 seconds. Recognize that emotion. And if you're struggling with what that emotion is, check out the How We Feel app. It's great for this. Take a deep breath and surround yourself with a prayer. Remind yourself that of your surroundings and where your body is located. Do something tactile, feel something, and sit with your emotion. Know that it's real and valid, and you're allowed to feel this way. Give it and yourself the space and the time you need to feel it, but don't wallow in it, I think is probably my takeaway there too. So after you take this time for yourself, and this may not happen immediately, you may need to come back to the article at a later time, you can move from the emotional processing to a more logical type of thinking.
That's absolutely right. And to help with that more logical thinking, some things that you can do are, one, you can separate facts from framing. Headlines, like we talked about, like to use words that provoke those emotions, words like chaotic, home, remove. And in the case of the Guatemalan children's story, listeners should focus on the core facts: the number of children involved, their ages, whether they are unaccompanied, what legal protections exist, and what the government's stated plan is. You can also try to understand context and look into the background of the issue. You may not have learned about it in your high school history class, but now could be a good time to go look into the history of some of these conflicts and our relationships with other countries. So in this story, these children aren't just numbers. Many fled violence or instability. They may have parents in Guatemala who do or don't want them returned. Knowing the broader humanitarian and legal context helps avoid assumptions. And you can also focus on law and policy, not just politics. Immigration decisions are shaped by statutes, court rulings, and agency procedures. There's so much that goes into immigration rulings and decisions. And understanding these rules separates legitimate concern for safety and fairness from purely partisan arguments.
It's interesting. We're talking about media, and the government also gets into this too, right? Because they are on social media, they're helping shape the narrative. And when I go to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services for a green card interview or a naturalization interview, we go into a lobby and there's a TV. sometimes with displays talking about what to do in case of severe weather or when to file a naturalization application. But lately, the messages have become a lot more insidious. There are images of people crossing the border. There are images that look like mugshots, and it just says criminal on every single picture. And they are of brown and black people, so they are trying to make you think these are all immigrants. That's the implied message. There are messages about doing things the right way. If you come the wrong way, if you mess up, you will be deported. And it's just a really negative environment that we're seeing right now. First time I saw this, I'm like, oh my gosh, like people are here to do things the right way. These are the people who are going through the process, and especially those who are going through citizenship. So I think about the negativity of these messages, especially for people who are applying for naturalization, who have done everything right and should have a clean record. Why are we creating an environment that is designed to provoke fear and anxiety before what could be someone's happiest moment of their life? So it's not just the media, unfortunately. I do want to highlight just a few other things that we see in the headlines and topics that need our thoughtful attention. Certainly, I think anything with immigration needs some careful consideration and parsing. But lately, we're hearing a lot about temporary protected status, also known as TPS. It's in the news right now because of ongoing litigation back and forth. Upwards of 500,000 people are losing their status because the government is revoking TPS protections for people. And TPS is temporary protected status. And I think sometimes people get confused and think that it's a permanent type of status or that it could lead to a green card for someone, but it does not. It can feel permanent, though. I understand that. People from Honduras, for example, have been allowed to live here under this status for 30 years. And then suddenly it gets revoked. And now they have 60 days to prepare to leave the United States, uprooting families, children from schools, housing considerations. I can't even imagine the checklist that they have to go through. And how do we focus on this without bias? Well, again, you look at the facts that this is temporary, that it does not lead to a green card, and it's designed to protect people from returning to unsafe conditions. I think about people from Afghanistan. Afghanistan had their TPS designation revoked. Is it really safe for people to return to Afghanistan? And what do we even mean by safe? I think about female clients who want to become doctors. They're not going to be able to do that there. So when you look at these headlines about TPS, just notice how they might exaggerate a little bit, talking about amnesty with TPS or people who are here illegally, because TPS is a type of status. They're not illegal immigrants.
That's right. And another type of status that is also not illegal is asylum seekers. We often hear, or at least I often hear, that people assume asylum seekers are here illegally. But according to both US and international law, as far as September 2025, seeking asylum is legal. It's legal according to international law and according to US law. And a common confusion also that people have is they assume that asylum is automatically granted or that anyone claiming fear of persecution is lying just so they can get a quicker way to enter into the country. But this is a really misunderstood group like TPS holders. And a way that you can look at asylum seeking without bias is you can look at the legal criteria. The person must prove a credible fear of persecution based on one of 5 protected categories. That's race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And I want to point out, notice that economic is not one of the reasons that you can apply for asylum. Many people say, oh, they're coming across the border to apply for asylum so they can work, or they need a job and that's why they're coming. But that doesn't actually fit one of the categories for asylum. You can apply for asylum based on economic status. So many people who are fleeing home for one of those 5 reasons that I mentioned, persecution due to race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, those people are often fleeing home for their life, and they don't have the ability to wait safely somewhere else for a legal process that could take years. Like refugees, as we've talked about before, it could take 10 to 20 years to get refugee status, and they have the same reasons for fleeing their country as asylum seekers. But refugees have the benefit of being able to wait in a second country for all that processing to take place. Asylum seekers really don't have that safe place, and they come to the United States, they stand on US soil, and they ask for asylum. That's the only way to get asylum, is to be in the US. You can't apply from another country. So when we separate political opinion from humanitarian need, we can recognize the humans created in the image of God behind the stories. We can also recognize the role of due process. Like we talked about earlier, due process is the right to have your day in court and to be represented fairly before a judge. And everyone in our country, regardless of citizenship, has the right to present their case before a judge and receive that fair hearing.
Absolutely. And then finally, I want to talk about just the large population of people that are in the United States currently without status. And I think there is some confusion. Number one, over the numbers, you can hear 11 million, 20 million. It's hard to even know where to start with that. But regardless, people assume that all undocumented immigrants broke the law in some way or that they have no rights. But Ashley, you just disabused us of that. So when you're looking at the undocumented population, you want to understand the spectrum of situations. People could have entered lawfully and they overstayed their visa. People may have expired work permits. I think about those with TPS. They had legal status up until recently, and now they have nothing. There's delayed paperwork, thinking about in victims of crime visas that it's going to take 25 years to get their status resolved. And then family reunification can also take years, 3 to 5 years to try and get status fixed there. And then you have people who have those cases filed, but those backlogs are so long. People might have filed an application and have status, but they don't have the document to actually prove it. And I also just real quick want to highlight too that these are people who do have legal protections. They have access to emergency medical care. Their children have rights. I know there's been some back and forth on whether undocumented children can use Head Start or not. And we just want to think about those who are in that gray area. And so many times we don't think about the gray area. They have legal status, but maybe not the documents to show that.
Tracie, I can attest to that. When you mentioned that legal gray area, I actually refer to it as the nebulous black hole. And I don't know if that's a good representation, but when my husband and I were going through his immigration process, we had applied for the fiancé visa and he got it. He came to the US. It's a 90-day visa, which if you've ever seen the show 90 Day Fiancé, don't believe it. It's the worst representation of that process that I've seen, but it's there. And so after 90 days, his visa expired and we had applied for the adjustment of status for his green card at that point. But for about 9 months, he didn't have any documents other than a letter from USCIS that said, "We're working on your case. This letter proves your legal status in the United States." But he couldn't leave the country. He couldn't work. He was just here waiting on that document to come in, his green card that would say, yes, now you have legal status as a legal permanent resident. He had legal status the whole time. He just didn't have documents to prove it. And so I call it the nebulous black hole in which we fell into and had to wait 9 months for this all to work out.
But thankfully, he has emerged from that black hole. He's not quite done with the process, is my understanding, though.
Yes, we have a little bit longer.
It never ends, it feels like. So coming back to the Guatemalan children's story, how do you talk about this with a friend or family member who might have strong opinions? In a previous episode, we talked about how leading with facts isn't always the most helpful way to make a point because it makes people feel that they're being corrected and they might double down on their beliefs. But that doesn't mean you can't stick to the facts. You can acknowledge feelings, but here you would focus on the kids' experiences. You want to ask questions and ground conversation in shared principles. That way you can discuss it without escalating conflict. So if you're initiating the conversation, start with facts, not emotions. Instead of leading with, "Oh my gosh, this is so terrible," start with something neutral, like about 700 unaccompanied Guatemalan children were scheduled for deportation last week. Some came without parents, and federal law gives them certain protections. And using these facts give you both a shared starting point before opinions kick in. And you could acknowledge emotions without arguing. You can say, "This feels shocking and unfair. I understand that. It feels that way to me. And if the person responds negatively to your story, ask them what makes them feel that way. Validating feelings makes it easier for someone to hear the facts without feeling attacked.
That's right. You can also focus on the human story, not politics. Emphasize the children's experiences and rights rather than the political party or administration. For example, you could say, these kids face real risks if they're sent back too soon, and some of the parents didn't even request their return. You can also ask questions, not just give the answers. We don't like being invited into conversations where the person you're talking with knows all the answers and assumes you don't. That doesn't set us off on a feeling of being equal or having both good responses to share in the conversation. So you can ask questions too. You can invite reflection. Do you know what legal protections unaccompanied minors have? And it's okay if you don't know the answers. Maybe you both come up with questions that you have, and then you agree to do some research and come back to talk about it together. Questions can engage curiosity and encourage curiosity rather than defensive debate. And finally, you can keep the conversation grounded in your broader principles that you both share. You might say, regardless of politics, I feel that most people agree children shouldn't be put at risk. How do you think the law balances safety with enforcement? How do you think it should balance safety with enforcement? These are questions that can get you both thinking and shifts the discussion from blame to problem solving.
So, what insights can you take from this story to act thoughtfully or responsibly in your community? Number one, just stay informed with the facts, not just the headlines. Take the time to understand immigration stories fully. Who's involved, what protections may exist, and what's actually happening. Accurate knowledge helps you avoid spreading fear or misinformation. You also want to listen to human experiences. Stories about children, families, and vulnerable people remind us that immigration is not just policy, it's real lives. Listening with empathy helps your community respond with care, not just with opinion.
You can also advocate within your means. This looks like supporting local legal aid organizations or shelters or immigrant resource centers. These are all concrete ways to help families navigate complex systems of immigration. And even small actions like donating supplies make a difference. If you have the bandwidth, I really encourage you to volunteer at one of these organizations, like a local refugee resettlement agency or one of the immigrant legal aid centers. These seem like a small action, but I can tell you as a former ministry volunteer manager, volunteers make all the difference in these organizations. Sometimes it's impossible to do the work without the volunteers. So the actions that you can make there actually contribute a lot, and it's huge with how you can help. It may feel small to you, but it will make such a difference. And a bonus side of that is that you'll get to meet immigrants and hear their stories personally. We've talked about how proximity is so important in understanding immigration. You can also model respectful dialogue. When you're talking with your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, focus on the facts, avoid assumptions, and validate their feelings. Your example can reduce misinformation and divisiveness in your community. And finally, you can engage civically. Stay aware of local and federal policies affecting immigrants and participate in public forums, town halls, or campaigns that promote fairness and safety. Thoughtful civic engagement strengthens your community's response together.
And I know that can seem scary, but starting small, starting local is huge. You realize how important your voice is, especially in a small town. And I just want to encourage you all to try and get outside your comfort zone to do something like that. It does make a difference. And so as we wrap up, I want to think about some conversation tips. If somebody repeats a misleading headline, and it's bound to happen, try saying something like, I saw that headline too. I'm really curious about the details behind it. You avoid reacting with anger or ridicule, and you shut down the conversation. Or you could ask, what makes you say that? Do you know what their sources were? And that's going to encourage them to think critically without feeling attacked. Or you can rephrase it, share the facts neutrally, like, yeah, those 700 Guatemalan children were mostly unaccompanied minors. Here without their parents, can you imagine? And federal law, though, gives them special protections. And you can look at it from the human angle. And for me, this is where I always find commonality. And you can say something like, regardless of policy, these kids are facing real risk and harms if they go back. And that's really worth considering. I like to point people back to how we're all made in the image of God and how we all deserve safety, protection, and love. And you can always end a conversation with a gentle reminder to reflect, not debate. You can say, yeah, it's definitely complicated. I don't have all the answers, but I think it's helpful to look at the full story before drawing any conclusions.
I think that's a great conversation tip for the week. Remember that the person in front of you is a human as well, and find commonality with them. So a small action that you can take this week is think of one headline related to immigration that you've heard recently, and then visit either Ad Fontes Media or the media bias chart from All Sides, which we mentioned earlier, and we'll have links in the show notes for you to get to them easily. And pick 2 media sources from different sides of the spectrum. I recommend not going really far right or left, but try to go just slightly left of center and slightly right of center to get a more balanced opinion on those news sources. And then read about that story from those 2 perspectives and notice how they report it. What's similar? What's different? What language does each one use? And what emotions arise in you from reading each story? Notice how you react and how you feel in your body. And then, as we said, take a moment to pray, ground yourself, and then move forward with trying to understand. And then finally, take your observations and share them with someone you trust. Someone maybe wants to read the same articles, or maybe they want to read different articles. Share your sources and see how you both come to conclusions on these articles.
And Ashley, you talked about the importance of prayer and being centered and focusing our attention on the higher kingdom of God. And so I think you have something special to share with us today.
I do. So as I've mentioned before, the organization that I work with, We Choose Welcome, has a guide called Engage the News, or How to Engage the News. And one of my colleagues, Brooklyn Stevens, wrote this prayer that I'd like to share with you all today. So if you would pray with me. God who sees, as our eyes behold the barbed wire, the wearied faces, and the bloodied clothes of fellow image bearers, would you look with compassion upon the suffering? We thank you that you come near to the brokenhearted, that you save those who are crushed in spirit. Lord, as we quake with anger and sorrow at what we see on our screens and in our communities, let us not become paralyzed in fear and discouragement. Give us power, love, and a sound mind as we gaze at the reality of brokenness in this world. Hear our cries, joining with our brothers and sisters on the margins. Give us hope for brighter days. As our bodies feel the weightiness of these horrific news stories, help us not to be numb to the pain. Keep us human. Keep us whole. Make our neighbors whole.
Amen. Well, if this episode helped you see the facts more clearly, please share it with someone who would benefit from hearing this. Take your small action this week and see how it changes the conversation you have about immigration. It probably was going to increase your confidence level too, which is amazing. Thank you so much for listening to Hope in Action, Navigating Immigration with Faith and Care. We'll see you next time.